G'day everyone, thanks for coming to this meeting. This will be about basically the sort of what the TPPA is about and why it shouldn't be implemented. So for next week's talk, it's going to be about why, from an evolutionary biology perspective, religion as a social phenomenon has arisen, and it will, analyse different perspectives within the literature, and then the lecturer himself will put forward his own view. In addition to this, on around September the 9th, which is going to be during the break, the RSS is going to be hosting a tertiary education debate with all the major political parties. So we'll be putting out Facebook details for that around a week or so. So keep your eyes posted for that. Right now, Professor Jane Kelsey.
All right. I decided not to bring any PowerPoints or any of that stuff. I'm just going to talk, give you a sense of what is happening with this animal called the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement. And then hopefully I will have triggered enough questions that we can have a good long Q&A. Okay? There is a very basic flyer that if you haven't got, you can pick some up, which is off a website called itsourfuture.org.nz. And that's where you can also find resources, activities that are happening, and there will be a major national mobilisation in November the 8th, I think, if that's a Saturday. If it's not, it's the 9th. But we will be doing lots of lead-up activities up until then. What I'm effectively going to talk about are 5 things. Who and what is the agreement? What are its stated goals? What are the commercial objectives and why they won't be met? What are some of the other areas of controversy that would be demands in return for those commercial objectives? And the issues around democracy and sovereignty. Given the name of the organisation, the first half will be their side, and the second half will be the critique. Although undoubtedly some bits of critique will slip in along the way. Who and what is the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement? It is a set of negotiations that began in March 2010, so they've been going for 4.5 years. Initially, they involved a cluster of relatively like-minded countries who decided that they were, in the branding of the agreement, going to develop a set of rules fit for the 21st century. It was going to be a gold standard agreement that, in the terminology of Star Wars, went where no other agreement had gone before. In particular, it would develop rules that would not be old-fashioned trade rules about movement of slabs of butter or motor cars. It would impose disciplines on governments behind the border, meaning disciplines on the kind of laws and policies and decisions that governments could make that affected commercial interests. So this was to be a new generation agreement. And a new generation agreement fit for the 21st century because these days we don't just do old-fashioned trade. If you think about the way your computer is made, the IP, the thinking stuff happens in one place, the componentries put together in another country, the technical work, the finicky work happens somewhere else, putting it all together happens somewhere else, the marketing happens through a whole lot of supply chains, you have transport structures that end up in different markets. So the goal from the commercial side was to streamline the supply chains to mean that integrated commercial activities could happen from woe to go, because that is the way that commerce and economic activities happen in the world today. That meant you'd also need to have rules around all of those things. You'd need to have rules about IP, who owns the knowledge, who gets to protect the knowledge, about storage of data, about transport systems, including internet transport systems for things like e-commerce or buying from Amazon.com. Who runs your inventories? Who runs your mining system and operations by computer from another country? So who controls the IP? Who controls the IT? Who controls the services and delivery structures? Who controls the movement of the people, whether it's the professionals and the experts, or the sales staff, or a little bit more sensitively, the labour? Additional rules about foreign investors, because if you've got this big integrated game plan, foreign investors need to be able to go and set up in places without impediments. They need to be able to expand, and they need to be able to have certainty about what the rules will be, and they need to be able to move money in and out and information in and out. And so foreign investors need to have rules. And they need not to have impediments put in their way by governments saying that they'll only favour local investors or local buyers, including of sensitive things like land. Likewise, they don't want restrictions on what they can buy. They don't want restrictions on regulations such as environment regulations and zoning regulations and rules against, for mining companies, fracking, and restrictions on advertising such as tobacco and so on. And so you get the picture of how behind the border these disciplines become. Likewise, they want to make sure that money can move around the world. Because if you can't have flows of money moving around the world, everything grinds to a halt. That's the blood supply that keeps that global commerce going. And so this agreement, which was to be the 21st century agreement of gold standards, was rules that would facilitate all of that happening. Remove the barriers. Impose disciplines on governments that would be enforceable against those governments by other states who are a party to the agreement, and by foreign investors from the countries that were part of the agreement. They started the negotiations in March 2010, and over time a number of other countries joined. So we currently have 12 countries involved in this negotiation. And if you think of it in a kind of geographical arc, Canada, US, Canada, US, Mexico, Peru, Chile, Australia, New Zealand, Singapore, Brunei, Malaysia, Japan, Vietnam. What do they have in common? They're starting to ask that question themselves, or they started a little while ago. But the idea was that those countries shared a common commitment to these gold standard rules. Therefore, they thought they could stitch the deal up within maybe 2 years. But it proved to be not quite so simple. Because redesigning the world according to the commercial interests of big commercial players and major powers, and bypassing all the other interests that might be affected by those rules, became rather controversial. We'll come to those controversies in a bit. So what are the commercial or economic gains that are expected out of this game plan? Well, those who are promoting it say you can't put a real figure on it until it's done, because we don't know what the final outcome's going to be. But if we don't know what its worth is until it's concluded and signed, then how can we guarantee that it's actually going to be a good deal? You can't do a cost-benefit analysis until the thing is completed and a done deal. You're buying a pig in a poke. You have no way of actually knowing, or am I using colloquialisms that aren't known to people? You have to remember my age. Now, there has been some econometric modelling done. Any economists here? What do you know about modelling? Okay, well, you didn't miss a lot. Modelling is a tool that is often used to project ballpark figures. But the projections use assumptions, like everyone is going to take all their barriers down. Everyone who loses jobs is immediately going to find new jobs. If industries collapse, new jobs will immediately take their place. Foreign investment can only bring good things and not take money out of the economy, and a whole lot of other kind of assumptions like that. And this modelling that was done projected the gains from the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, so we were told, would be between $4 and $6 billion for New Zealand. Then we tried to find out a little bit more about, well, one-off $4 or $6 billion, or $4 or $6 billion every year? What were the assumptions? What was it contingent upon? Did it factor in the additional costs of medicines that might result from the IP chapter? Did it include what the costs of defending cases and the potential damages of investment disputes might be? Did it take account of what might happen with collapses of particular markets? And so we got some economists in Wellington to examine the methodology. And they said, well, the orthodox parts are the normal questionable kind of methodology for econometric modelling, but they even made up some new bits that no one's ever used before. They assumed that Korea, for example, was a part of it when it's not. They assumed that everyone will give up all of their tariffs, for example, on dairy, which is never going to happen. And so the Prime Minister was challenged to stop using those figures. We sort of got down to $2 billion in the latest downgrading of those figures. So at best, at present, the government's line is that the value to New Zealand would be $2.4 billion. But we still don't know whether that's a one-off or whether it's year by year. Now, anyone who's an economist or anyone who follows ordinary trade transactions will know that the exchange rate makes a great deal more difference to what our exports and imports balance looks like than 2.4 billion. Yeah? There are a whole variety of other factors that will influence those calculations. In addition, the calculations assume that there are no downsides. So any of the potential costs are not factored in. And any of the qualitative costs, such as the impact on our ability to make our own decisions, don't figure in the play at all. So the best case modelling of the agreement is far from watertight. But it gets more problematic still because, I probably should have brought the map along, but if you think of that arc of countries, the gains that they will make are actually very few because most of those countries already have free trade deals with each other. So there's very few barriers between them, in fact, to come down. New Zealand, for example, already has agreements with Chile, Australia, Singapore, Brunei, Malaysia, and Vietnam. The ones it doesn't have agreements with, the big ones that really matter, are the US and Japan. But the US and Japan are not about to take all the agriculture barriers to dairy products away, or New Zealand. And at present, what we've been seeing, for those of us who track the negotiations, are that the US and Japan have decided that they will negotiate between each other, and they will make a deal between each other, and then they'll negotiate with the rest. Now that means, because they both have things to protect, this is going to be far from Tim Gross's gold standard where all tariffs and all barriers are removed. Right? The Japanese have said there are 5 sacred products that they will protect, and one of those is dairy. The US has said Japan must take all its dairy protections away, but we won't. So the US has said, oh, okay, we've got agreements with a number of these other countries, and yeah, those can wait. They can stay as they are. And we'll negotiate with the countries that we don't have agreements with on a one-on-one basis, which means that even though we gave that much dairy to Australia in their agreement, we don't have to give any dairy to New Zealand. So we are currently in this chess game, even playing around those questions of the main commercial interest that New Zealand claims of dairy. And the last negotiations that I was at, it was clear as well, which was in Ottawa, the Canadians, who are another potential market for New Zealand, have said they've offered nothing to New Zealand. Now, there are brave words from the Minister that all of this is going to, that they'll all see the light in the end, and they will all remove all these barriers. We think that that's the territory of flying pigs, but let's just assume for the moment that that may be the case. What is the price that will get paid for whatever we get in the commercial domain? Oh, no, I missed one thing. I should have said. There is another part of the game plan for Fonterra and Co. You know how we've got issues here about growing too many cows? Yeah? What's happening with the waterways, what's happening with the climate change issues, and so on. Yeah? Amount of fertiliser that needs to go for intensified farming, for converting farms from sheep to dairy and so on. And there are recognised to be limits if we're going to keep the cows in the sunshine eating the grass. Right? Now, we could move to intensified farming. intensified dairy where they live half the year in the sheds and eat grain and so on. Right? Not good for the image of New Zealand dairy. Possible, but not favoured. So aside from getting access to the markets by barriers coming down to dairy, Fonterra and others can expand into other countries if the investment rules are liberalised in those countries to allow them to buy land or farms or enter into joint venture farms of corporate farming, of processing the products in those countries and then exporting to other countries. So it becomes what they call made by New Zealand rather than made in New Zealand. Now there are questions about who gets the benefits from that. And to some extent, because of the shareholding in Fonterra, it still includes dairy farmers, but also includes some others, that some of that money at least would come back here, so long as Fonterra remains that dairy co-op. But Fonterra already has those kind of operations in Latin America, it has them in parts of Asia, it's been setting them up in China and so on. So that is the other potential gain for the agriculture industry. And when I was talking to me, when I went to something where the minister spoke on Tuesday, he was saying that the goal is to expand New Zealand's exports and New Zealand's linkages through the agribusiness sector dramatically over the next 10 years. So that is the sort of commercial side. What is the price for this? Assuming other countries are going to both open up their investment and open up their dairy markets. Well, there's a handful of examples that I want to raise with you to give a sense of how broad-ranging this is and why it's caused such controversy. One that you may have seen in the media is about the way New Zealand buys medicines. We have a scheme called FARMAC. FARMAC, ironically, was set up by Roger Douglas, those of you who are familiar with that era. Or the idea was generated then. FARMAC has a pot of money, a limited, capped pot of money that it can spend on medicines. And the drug companies know that. That gives FARMAC a lot of leverage in negotiating with the pharmaceutical companies how much it will pay for a medicine. Because the drug companies can sell whatever they like, provided it's been approved, but if they want to get the subsidy from the government, they have to get the sign-off by FARMAC. Now, FARMAC has a formula it uses to work out what is the price it will offer to the drug company for a particular medicine. And that includes calculations that relate to the availability of generic medicines or non-brand name medicines, which are a great deal cheaper than the patented branded medicines. Right? Now, the US drug companies and the New Zealand offshoots of them hate FARMAC. Not because we're a big market here, but because we set a really bad example for other countries. There is a potential precedent-setting nature to FARMAC. So to bust the cap on FARMAC is really important. And there are two ways to white ant FARMAC. FARMAC is not going to be abolished. And sometimes the minister, I'm sure innocently misrepresents this by saying, we're not going to abolish FARMAC. All they're saying is nonsense. Well, we've never said that they're going to abolish FARMAC. What they're going to do is undermine it. in two ways. The first is, and we know this because of leaked texts and other commentaries, is to change our patent laws about the patenting of medicines and the control of the data that relates to patented medicines and the approvals of generic medicines, so that generics are delayed in being able to be sold in the country, and therefore that will affect the ability of Pharmac to use the generics in the formula, and will complicate the approval processes once the data becomes available. So one set of changes would be changing the patent laws. A second way of white-anting Pharmac is through what is quaintly called transparency in healthcare technologies. And this one's been leaked several times as well. By transparency in healthcare technologies, they mean effectively giving the pharmaceutical companies more of a seat at the table of the decision-making process. Right? Requiring Pharmac to provide much more information about the formulas that it's using, the calculations and the criteria, being open to question and to challenge over the way that they're making their judgment calls, potentially access to review of their decisions and so on. And it's actually that one that is considered much more valuable to the pharmaceutical companies. So if we're talking about a free trade agreement, this has nothing to do with free trade. This is about patent monopoly rights. Right? It's about monopolies. Right? That's what a patent is. It's an exclusive right over a period of time. And so the intention is to extend those monopoly rights and to go behind the border into the processes of the decision making. So it's not just what the decisions, it's how the decisions are made and who has the right to participate in the decisions. So that's a big one. Right? And the health community here and in many other countries has been very active around this, especially the HIV/AIDS communities, but also those who are watching the developments of biologics. Biologics are the new living organism kind of medicines that are the cutting edge for cancer treatments and so on. And they will be the new area for pharmaceuticals in the future. And there's particular targeting happening of biologics. And that has got groups like the Cancer Society and others very concerned. Second area, which has generated a great deal of activism in many countries, is IT. Now, when a lot of these older agreements were negotiated, the World Wide Web didn't even exist. Right? World Trade Organization came into effect in 1995. Right? We were just working out this thing called the internet and the World Wide Web and so on. Right? Since then, there's been a burgeoning of the IT area. And there are these big debates between the global commons, who controls information, rights of access to information, and those who are the IT industry, the Microsofts and the IBMs and so on, who have had a very lucrative control over most of the software, but also the industries like Hollywood, the music industry, who are really concerned about what they see as breaches of their copyright. I'm sure none of you have ever downloaded things you shouldn't have downloaded. But as we can see from the mega upload examples, you know, the technology is now so far out there, and there are a lot at stake. Yeah, that's what that whole dispute is about. But there are also some problems for entities like Disney. Right? The way copyright works at present, in this country, for example, is that something, a film or an piece of artwork or a piece of music or whatever is copyrighted for the life of the author plus 50 years. It's actually a long time. But some things like Mickey Mouse are now getting to the point of life plus 50 or life plus 60 or life plus 70. So copyright term extension becomes an important issue. So does control over ISPs and requiring ISP providers to monitor and police who is using the internet through them. And not simply to give notices, but to prosecute or be prosecuted. So criminalisation of the ISPs. Or, you know, sometimes how you buy a CD in one part of the world and it's got a lock on it. You bought it legally, you paid good money for it, you come back here, you try to play it and you can't. Right? It's got a technology protection mechanism on it. Right? Circumventing that should become a criminal offence. Now, so the IP sector itself wants to have other kinds of monopoly rules. And they want us, already Australia and some others have adopted life plus 70, for example, in their free trade agreements with the US. Oman adopted either life plus 110 or 120 in their one with the US. So this is a major issue in play. The third of the five I want to talk about, I'm going to talk about this one more briefly, is we just had a financial crisis globally. And those of you who've seen the movies will know that there were problems like banks and insurance companies and so on that got too big to fail, could make the rules themselves and start to dictate to governments what the rules should be and what the bailouts should be. Who operated by the internet into other countries that weren't the countries that regulated them. That operated in shadow banking systems that were so invisible and opaque and, that's the same thing, Jane, and complex and so on that central bankers didn't understand them, some of the traders didn't understand them. I'm sure John Key, who's an ex-trader for Merrill Lynch, probably did. But, because Merrill Lynch did a lot of this trading, started a lot of this trading in the early 2000s. But it all went whiz-bang, up in smoke. Well, the financial services chapter, as we understand it, and we had a leaked version of a twin negotiation on WikiLeaks last month, would basically lock countries into that light-handed, risk-tolerant approach to regulating finance sector. And US agreements do not contain any rules that provide an exception for governments in a balance of payments emergency. Now, this is an area I work a lot in, and it's a recipe for pending disaster if you look closely at our economy, which is currently based, one, on dairy and two, on what I call FIRE, finance, insurance, and real estate. The fourth area is another digital zone, e-commerce. Now, e-commerce involves things like, you know, buying stuff, retail stuff across the border by the internet and so on, your Amazon.com stuff and so on. E-commerce involves the internet banking system. E-commerce involves actually a growing range of things. Education is being taught from offshore. You can access telemedicine from offshore. You can buy plans for your house from offshore. You can probably even buy your essay for your course from offshore, but you shouldn't. But there is a more sinister element to the e-commerce chapter. One of the things that Snowden showed us in his leaks was how much data trawling is taking place. Data trawling is facilitated by servers that are located in countries that, one, have very weak privacy protections, and two, have very strong spy laws that might require entities to deliver up metadata. And the principal amongst those countries is the US. What we understand is in the e-commerce chapter is a prohibition on what is called localization of data. A number of countries require that data of various kinds, financial data, data about health, data about a wide range of things, in some cases all data, is held on servers inside the country. So it can be subject to the regulations of the country. Once it's outside the country, forget regulating it. Now, of course, Google and co don't like that because they're developing clouds and all sorts of other things that notionally are in the ether, but clouds still need servers, or so I'm told. Not my forte. So Google and co have been supporting this because it's good for them. Amazon.com and others have been supporting this because it's good for them. But the US is also supporting it because it means that the database can be located in the US. And that is a major issue in terms of what is happening with the security and the surveillance and the privacy breaches now. The final of the examples, you're getting a sense of one's nothing to do with trade? The final of the examples is the foreign investment rules. Now, I'm not going to go through a lot of them. This one has been leaked as well some time back. There are a variety of rules that lock in your existing foreign investment rules so that you can't make them any more restrictive of foreign investors, which potentially poses a problem for various political parties' election manifestos at present, but which also carries various guarantees to foreign investors that effectively the rules won't change on them after they've made their investments. Now, if you think about the very neoliberal climate that we are in, and the fact that if you look at leaky buildings, or you look at Pike River, or you look at the rest home industry, or you look at the finance sector, there have been a whole series of catastrophes from light-handed regulation. Now, one of the big problems, and of course been the privatisations that some people say they want to reverse. One of the problems with these investment rules is that if you have an investor from one of these TPPA countries and you change the rules in ways that it substantially affect the value of their investment or the profitability of their investment, they will claim that the New Zealand government has breached its obligations of what is quaintly called fair and equitable treatment or indirect expropriation under the agreement. This has become hugely controversial internationally, to the point that Germany and France have said in the EU negotiation with the US they won't agree to this. A deal between the EU and Canada that was almost signed off is now not being signed off because Germany is saying we won't agree to this. Why is Germany not agreeing? Because Germany is currently facing two of these cases. One of them over the closure of a nuclear power plant following the Fukushima disaster, and the second over tightening up rules around hydro and geothermal schemes following the release of the Stern Report on climate change. Other countries are currently closing down their obligations under these agreements. South Africa was notoriously sued over post-apartheid policies by a mining company that claimed that seeking to redistribute the mining sector to bring more under the Black Empowerment Scheme was discriminatory against the foreign investor. India is currently being sued over court decisions that terminated licenses for telecommunications that the court found had been corruptly issued. Canada, where there is a controversy of its own underway, is currently being sued, one, for Quebec having a moratorium on fracking, and two, a court decision of the highest court in Canada that refused a patent for a medicine, saying that the patent application failed Canada's test, and that is being challenged as a breach of fair and equitable treatment. Now, the purpose of these cases is not to get to court and get megabucks. That's at the end of the process. The purpose is to have what we call the chilling effect on getting governments to back off under the threat of such a dispute. And where is New Zealand facing that at present? No. Yeah, plain packaging tobacco. Right? Australia's already got one of these disputes against it by Philip Morris, who managed to find a treaty in Hong Kong and relocate their corporate presence there. And the New Zealand government, which the National made a commitment to the Māori Party that it would introduce and pass plain packaging legislation as part of the Confidence and Supply Agreement. That legislation was belatedly introduced, but it ended up not even being reported back from the Select Committee before the House rose. And the government said that the legislation would not be brought into effect until the litigation against Australia had been concluded. Now that can take some years. If Australia wins, then we won't stare down the tobacco companies, is my guess. So maybe it's fair enough. Maybe the rules shouldn't change on them. Well, part of the problem is that these cases aren't heard before proper courts. They're heard before offshore, private, ad hoc, that is one-off tribunals, where the judges are 1 week investment lawyers bringing cases for investors, and the next week acting as judges in tribunal hearings. There are no conflict of interest rules that prevent that happening. These tribunals do not operate like our courts through systems of precedents and judgment rulings that apply. They are laws to themselves. They are widely varying. Poor old Argentina at present has got vulture funds cases that brought up distressed debt, and they're now being demanded by a major US vulture fund to pay back the full face value of the bonds. And Argentina's gone into default again. So these stakes are really high. Our government has said it will agree to this. However, some other countries are resisting. So that is the kind of controversy that is surrounding the negotiations. My point 5, the final question, is about democracy and sovereignty. These negotiations are taking place in secret. For the first 3 years, 3 and a bit years, we at least knew where the negotiations were happening. And because we created enough of a fuss, they had what was a token stakeholder presence. We didn't actually get anywhere near the rooms, but there was an opportunity to present to the negotiators in a couple of hours space and to at least have access to those negotiators who wanted to talk to us. Some of us do a lot of specialised technical work around this that negotiators are interested in. But since August last year, it's gone completely underground. Not only is there no stakeholder process, but they don't tell us where they're meeting. Now, sometimes negotiators tell us where they're meeting. They quite like us being there. By us, we're down to about 3 or 4 of us now. The Ottawa meeting that was last month, initially it was informally announced it will be in Vancouver. And then about 10 days before, oops, no, they've moved it to Ottawa because there were going to be protests in Vancouver. No timetable, no dates on when negotiators were going to be there. I've applied consistently under the Official Information Act to find out when officials from New Zealand's ministry will be negotiating on our behalf, on what topics and on what dates in what country, and they refuse to release it on the basis that that information has been provided to them in confidence by the host government. Meetings in Vietnam that we had before the Ottawa ones, the US hosted the meetings in Vietnam and Singapore, and it put up the information on the second day of the negotiations about the round that was happening, where it was happening, when it was happening, and even that was inaccurate because we were there and we knew it was inaccurate. So this is a game. Right? We've got another round in Hanoi on the 3rd of August. No one will even confirm it's Hanoi or where and so on. So why are they doing this? Because transparency is dangerous. Not transparency of the kind the pharmaceutical industry wants, but transparency that actually sheds daylight on this. Indeed, they have agreed amongst themselves right at the beginning of the negotiations that the text will not be released until it is signed, that is, until the negotiations are concluded. Contrary to what happens at the World Trade Organization, contrary to what happened in the Anti-Counterfeiting Trade Agreement, the Free Trade Area of the Americas, and so on. So we're told it's always done this way. Well, it's not always done this way. I've done an OIA for that, but I've been told it would require too much compilation. In addition to not releasing the text until it's signed, all the background documents will not be released for 4 years beyond when it's signed. So we will not be able to know what our government has put on the table, what positions it's taken, and hold them to account for 4 years after the agreement comes into effect. Agreements like this are negotiated by the Cabinet. Negotiating mandate is set by the Cabinet, decisions on the way through are made by the Cabinet, the decision to sign is made by the Cabinet, and the decision to ratify or bring it into force in relation to New Zealand is made by the Cabinet. There are requirements to present the text after it is signed, which under international law means you have shown in good faith you intend to adopt the agreement. But Parliament can't change the agreement. The Select Committee can hear submissions, but those submissions are meant to be concluded within 15 sitting days. That means after the bill gets tabled in Parliament and gets referred to the Select Committee, there are 15 days for people to get this telephone book, read and understand the telephone book, analyse it, write submissions, get submissions to the Select Committee, have oral submissions before the Select Committee, the Select Committee produce its report. It's a nonsense. It might be extended, but even if it is, the Select Committee can't recommend changes to the agreement. It's true that some laws will need to be passed to make New Zealand comply with the agreement. Now, normally, that process of those laws would take place before the government ratifies the agreement or brings it into force, because otherwise we would be in breach of the agreement by having laws that don't meet the requirements. What we expect to happen is that the government will do most things, if possible, by regulation rather than by legislation, so it won't need to go before the House. Even if it does go before the House, Labor is ambivalent. Half of Labor supports it, half of Labor opposes it. What position they would take, whether they would take a bipartisan approach as they have in the past with National, remains to be seen. So even if it was put to a symbolic vote in Parliament to support the agreement, Labor could well go that way. But my final point I want to make on this, which is something that will come into the media tomorrow, is that our Parliament is not actually going to be that autonomous in deciding whether to pass those laws. Not only will it be under pressure because once a government has committed to an agreement, there is enormous pressure to pass the necessary legislation and for New Zealand not to be seen to be a bad player in the international trade arena. But what we're going to release tomorrow is a new website called TPP No Certification. It's a catchy name, which is about what I've called in my press release the TPPA's dirty little secret. The US Congress has powers under the Constitution over trade, which means that an agreement has to be approved by the US Congress. Now, the US Congress, therefore, has all sorts of interests, which can say we'll have this bit, but we won't have that bit, and go back and negotiate that bit, and so on. To bypass that, there is a process called fast track, which means that if the Congress grants the President fast track, that agreement, the concluded agreement, will have to be voted yes or no, can't be picked apart. But to get fast track, which Obama doesn't currently have, Congress will set preconditions as to what has to be in the agreement. But let's assume Obama has fast track, and Congress votes yes to the agreement. Yay, everyone says, it's done now. Right? However, a condition that Congress has put on these agreements in the past, in the legislation to implement it in the US, is that the President cannot notify the other country that the US has done everything it needs to do until that other country has changed its laws and its regulations and its administrative procedures to comply with what the US says that country's obligations are under the agreement. That is the US interpretation of New Zealand's obligations under the agreement. Now, these agreements are usually deliberately vague and opaque. They are full of weasel words. In the documentation that we have done of how the US has used this, it has gone beyond just insisting that its interpretation of these weasel words, usually the reason they're weasel words is that other countries have resisted the US's interpretation, but the US gets to demand that that interpretation prevails. It has said, oh, you said orally in the back room such and such, so you need to do that as well. And in relation to Guatemala on one of these medicines issues, which Guatemala did refuse to adopt, the US said, we will not certify unless you adopt these rules on biologics. The US then sends a list to the other country of what it needs to do. It often sends its officials to the other country to help oversee the drafting of the legislation. It requires the legislation to be sent back to the US for review and amendment before it's introduced to the Parliament. So the US gets to vet and approve and give its seal of approval to the legislation or the regulation. Now, I just want to I am aware of the time. I just want to read you two quotes out of documents that were secured under the Freedom of Information Act in the US dealing with the Peru negotiations. These are internal emails of the equivalent of the Ministry of Trade. One said, we have to redraft the regulations and the law. Peru needs to accept them without changes. Now that related to a forestry law that was hugely controversial because of its impact on Indigenous peoples. The consequence of that law was what was known as the Bargoa Massacre. Another one about a similar thing said, if the Peruvians accept our language as we, the USTR, propose it, we still have the possibility of wrapping everything up by November the 10th. If Peruvians try to negotiate the law, then all bets are off. So we end up with this absurd situation of the US claiming the right to draft and dictate what the interpretation of the agreement should be and what the laws to implement them should be. Now, if that hasn't scared the heck out of you, I haven't done my job. We know that negotiators themselves are really worried about this last process, which is why we've set up the website with all of the documentation that we can find. We know that for New Zealand, the principal targets will be Farm Act, the patents laws, the Farm Act processes, the copyright laws, the foreign investment regime, and Fonterra, which is seen as an anti-competitive monopoly. So we will continue trying to get people aware of these things. It's your future, not my future. It's at stake here, and your ability to make your decisions about what the country should look like in the 21st century. It's kind of your 21st century, not the US corporations. So, questions?
You talked about the importance of releasing the text publicly. You talked about the background documents. Is that including the national interest analysis? And then I'm just wondering if you can contrast, say, task-free trade agreements with this current one in relation to releasing those documents before it's ratified or something like that. Jane, could you just
I will paraphrase it. See you, Chris. The question relates to the release of the texts and the background documents and the precedents for releasing them, and then there's a question relating to what is known as the national interest analysis. Maybe I'll start with the NIA first. There is a requirement under the Standing Orders of Parliament, the Cabinet Manual, that govern what happens with treaties. That when a treaty is tabled, it must have tabled with it something called a national interest analysis. But that national interest analysis is not done until the negotiations are concluded and is not released until the text itself is tabled in the House. The national interest analysis is prepared by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade, which is the same entity that has negotiated the agreement. What it considers to be a problem with the agreement, what others may consider to be a problem with the agreement, MFAT may well not consider to be a problem with the agreement, and we've had that issue in the past. The NIA only covers a limited range of issues, and one of the arguments there has been for a long time is the need for an independent NIA, and an independent NIA conducted before an agreement is signed. So at present, it is both an inadequate document and it doesn't help with the transparency of the process. The texts themselves, I mean, one of the problems with secrecy is, of course, it results in leaks. And we've had a number of leaks that some cases have not shown the positions of particular countries, and in some cases have shown the positions, so that we've been able to see, for example, what New Zealand has been doing. Some background documents have been leaked as well, including paper from New Zealand on pharmaceuticals early on, or IP early on, that showed New Zealand was taking a strong position. Now, in a sense, and we've argued this in vain, not only is it what you would expect if you had legislation being developed, you have an exposure draft developed and put into the public domain, and you have submissions and background documents and so on, but it can actually strengthen the hands of negotiators if they're taking a good position and they can point to a lot of support in the country for what they're doing. And indeed, I know that the leak of the IP one did help the New Zealand IP negotiators quite a lot, of saying, look, we can't make concessions because, you know, there's this groundswell at home. It's interesting that the European Ombudsman has just come out in the parallel negotiation, what we call TTIP, between the US and the EU, to say that that secrecy can't operate in relation to those negotiations, that it is not an acceptable lawmaking process. So what have the precedents in New Zealand been? For the FTAs since 2000 with Singapore, the current process, not the process about the background documents, but the process about not releasing the text, has been the approach that has been taken. It is not the approach that's been taken in some plurilateral, that is multi-party ones. The ACTA agreement, the Anti-Counterfeiting Trade Agreement, which is the precursor to quite a lot of what's in the IP chapter here, was initially leaked and then it was released. Both the US and New Zealand were parties to that negotiation. And several iterations of it were released. The World Trade Organization, with the Doha round negotiations there have been long pressures to get transparency in the WTO, which involves equally complex and sensitive negotiations. And not only are the texts released, or the chair's texts released, but all of the committee meetings are put up on the website for you to access with a bit of a time delay. The level of they're a paragon of transparency in comparison to what we're meeting now. The free trade area of the Americas, between the US and a number of other Latin American countries, that text was completely released during the negotiations. Now, Tim Grosser has said quite bluntly that the reason people want the text released is to stop the agreement happening. To which the response is, well, if you can't convince people that the agreement is in the national interest, then shouldn't it be released so people can see and debate it? I don't know whether, I actually suspect that some more, and I literally don't know. I suspect some more texts will be released, because if countries are feeling that they're pressured into accepting positions to get a deal done, then that's when negotiators get really nervous and feel that they are responsible for the future. But there is a very, very tight level of security around the texts at present.
I'm just quite curious, within the New Zealand context, who do you think, or what do you think is driving the obsession with the TPP, which has been going on now for a long time, if you go right back to the P4?
Yeah, I suppose we should explain to people what the P4 is and how it links to this, because it's a spurious link in a way. New Zealand negotiated an agreement between itself and Singapore and Chile and Brunei, which didn't contain financial services and investment, because they were very sensitive in Chile at the time. It had been pushed into an agreement with the US, and it really didn't want to deal with that. But there was a window of 3 years when they would have to start to be negotiated, and when that began, the US then said it would join the P4 negotiations. Now, the US never joins anyone else's agreement. I mean, so when those negotiations began, they went from the US template on financial services. And then they grew. There are 2 drivers that were behind the P4 and behind the TPPA. And I should explain why we call it the TPPA. Right? Formally, it's the TPP. Well, it's nothing about a partnership in this at all. So we insist that it's an agreement. And so we call it the TPPA rather than the TPP, which drives the minister crazy. Or so we think. The minister, before he was a minister, a long-term negotiator for New Zealand, had a game plan. The World Trade Organization was meant to be the big rule-making body when it was set up in 1995. But then they tried to extend it by having a new round of negotiations that were to be launched in 1999 in Seattle. And there were massive protests in Seattle. Right? And there was massive dissension inside the membership as well. So that wasn't launched. And Tim Grosser wrote a speech in 99 or 2000 where he referred to the Trojan horse strategy. And the Trojan horse strategy was, if you can't achieve from above, you build from below the Trojan horse. Starting with bilateral agreements, New Zealand, Singapore, New Zealand might have then New Zealand, Singapore, Brunei, Chile, Australia's there in CER, and then the P5 was the idea of bringing the US, actually US and Australia were supposed to be P5, Brunei didn't count. And then you make it bigger and bigger, and you eventually get to a free trade area of the Asia Pacific. All the APEC members becoming part of this big scheme that has gold standard rules.
So is this an official / Tim Grosser-led ongoing narrative strategies?
Yeah, it's that is the political driver, right? And then you have the commercial driver, which is the interests of Fonterra. Right? To a lesser extent, meat and lamb, but predominantly the interests of Fonterra. And New Zealand has an honorary agriculture ambassador who has been attending the negotiations, not in the room itself, but as aligned to the government delegation. And there should be no doubt, I mean, there isn't an equivalent internet industry person. So you have the commercial interests, and you have the strategic interests. And then, of course, this is the only way we'll get an agreement with the US or Japan, because they won't negotiate bilaterally with us.
So you said that inflation and the money exchange affects the bottom line far more than these agreements. So just playing devil's advocate for a second, what would be the result from New Zealand's economy if we didn't enter into this agreement? And what would be the result or the penalty if we entered into this agreement, we had a change of government, and then we flipped everyone the bird? How easy is it to pull out of this agreement? What would be the repercussions?
What would we lose by not entering into this agreement? Well, assuming that what we will get is a crumb of blue cheese and a slice of cheddar, nothing, in a commercial sense. And that appeared for a while to be what Tim Grosser was conceding. At the Singapore ministerial meeting in May, he started talking down the objectives. And that's certainly how it was looking then. couple of things have happened in the US Congress where they've made some quite stroppy statements in the last couple of weeks. And at a speech that the minister gave last Tuesday at the US Chamber of Commerce that I was invited by one of the business people to attend, much to the minister's dismay, he was again saying we are expecting a gold standard agreement of every barrier being removed. It's not going to happen. No way it's going to happen. But he said it would be okay if it was on a long period of time, maybe 20 years. But he predominantly talks about Japan. He doesn't ever use the same rhetoric about the US. It's very interesting. So the commercial side of it, not much would happen. Unless Abe did something that would create such chaos inside Japan by making those complete concessions. I can't see him doing it. What would happen if there was a change of government and they withdrew from the negotiations? That could happen. I mean, there's a variety of scenarios. That could happen, and it would sour relations with the US. Depends on how important those are. A second thing they could do could be to change the negotiating mandate to up the New Zealand position to a point that could not reach agreement. And then could walk away with pride, or the agreement could remain at stalemate. And there are a number of countries that would really quite like that to happen. Yeah? They're all in it for different reasons. But a third thing that could happen is that they could sign the agreement but never ratify it. So it becomes an agreement that New Zealand negotiates and signs, but never takes that next step of bringing it into force in relation to New Zealand. And I suspect that some of the countries are thinking of doing that because walking away is too difficult. There will be a provision to exit it, but exiting it carries a real price. Threats of credit rating downgrades, threats of investor flight and strike, political damage, because all hell would break loose if New Zealand did that. New Zealand considers itself an exemplary citizen in the international arena here. And so if New Zealand was seen to be breaching, seen to be withdrawing, then not only would that be seen as sabotaging the New Zealand agricultural economy and the confidence investors could have, but New Zealand having a vote of no confidence in these rules internationally. The last thing we could do is to breach something. Yeah? Not breach the whole agreement, but say, this thing is so important. Plain packaging, which Australia said. This is so important to us, we're not going to have our health policies dictated to us by Philip Morris. We will stare you down in this investment tribunal. And that's not caused Australia harm, partly because tobacco is not a very sexy cause for people who want to critique Australia's position, but also Australia's had that position about investor-state disputes for some time. If it was us changing our laws on Pharmac to reverse what we might have agreed to, then there would be big attacks on New Zealand in the international arena, and we would have to decide whether that's what sovereignty is about. So the thing that has to happen is for it not to get signed. Once it's signed, you're in a bit of a problem. Oh, God, I hope it's soon. I hope they just walk. I keep saying to them, well, I shouldn't say walk away. It's not a...
Could we walk away if another country...
Yes, we could walk away.
No, I mean, politically, if another country did walk away, would that strengthen our position to be able?
Yeah, it's a question of who blinks first. Now, when I've raised this about when they've said, we will never sign an agreement that's not in New Zealand's interests and does not have extensive agriculture liberalisation and so on. I said, well, you know, you're not going to get it, so when are you going to walk away? We'll never walk away so long as the US is at the table. Yeah? There are several other countries where there are strong domestic pressures. Malaysia, there's a big domestic pressure because government procurement, government spending money buys from Bumiputra, from indigenous Malays, and there's very sensitive issues, a range of other sensitive issues in Malaysia. Chile, it has agreements with everybody. Yeah? So there's nothing in it for them. And they've got a new government, the Bachelet government, and she has said, we will not give more on IP, which the US has said is an absolute that they must have for the US Congress. So it's possible that Chile might say it's not worth the candle. Quite how and when they might do that, don't know. I don't think anyone will walk away until the time of the signing, if there is a signing, and then it will be a country that doesn't sign.
If it's really unlikely that we'll ever get the agricultural concessions that we want, then do you think it would be very unlikely that we'd ever ratify it? Would you say that?
No. No. There is a lot of brave talk present in that. Yeah. My take is that the minister will take whatever he can get. And then he will, like the other night, apart from upping the ante on it again, he was saying, oh, there'll need to be some minor changes to our patent laws and so on, but we can live with that. Yeah. So there'll be a downplaying of what the costs are. And some of them may be costs that don't emerge immediately. Yeah? And with the right of investors to sue, who knows when it would happen. I mean, my pick at present is something like all those mining licenses that have been granted now. If you get governments that come in that re-regulate those in a way that the mining companies object to, don't get their way, that's a kind of dispute. New Zealand's very different from other countries. We have almost none of these agreements. We have one with China, which is what's making the current Shanghai Pengchen discussion quite interesting. So, yeah, it'll be spun. But it'll be spun after it's signed, so... I don't know. I mean, Canada has said, as I understand it, that they have made the same offer to everybody at present, all the other 11 countries, which is nothing on dairy. If the US demands more from Canada on dairy, it will give a special deal to the US and not to the others. Japan reached a deal with Australia. It was a bilateral deal, which Fonterra and others were furious about, because it literally involved a slice of cheddar and a little bit of ice cream. And lots of statements were made here that that was unacceptable. Now, why do we think New Zealand's going to get more from Japan than Australia got from Japan? The US, as I said, has refused at present to reopen, has refused to put dairy on the table with New Zealand, and it's doing a bilateral there. That's as we understand it. It may give a incy-wincy bit. New Zealand doesn't actually have a problem exporting to the US at present, from what we understand. Can't fill its quotas to the EU. So there's not a rational kind of discussion around it, I suppose, is what I'm saying. It may change when the political pressures come to bear, but we don't have a lot of negotiating coin in this table.
That's why it's so interesting. New Zealand's one of the most favoured free traders
But we gave everything away. We've got nothing to bargain. Yeah? You can sign up to the Facebook page on It's Our Future, which has got links to other things. There's a Gaza rally on Saturday.
Thank you.